Everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Tamar Stone, a renowned book artist and fan favorite among UW Special Collections librarians. Tamar's work is inspired by her own experiences and captures moments in women's lives when issues of appearance, self-esteem, and assimilation become paramount due to physical restrictions placed on the body, either by fashion or medical necessity. We often feature Tamar's work in our exhibits, but wanted to focus on her creative prowess for Medium as the Message, Lived Experience is the Story, which is our current exhibit, due to her choice of medium and focus on health marginalization in her work. One of our key texts for the spring summer exhibit is Epileptic, and it has these themes at its core. In person today, we have many of Tamar's pieces on display for your viewing pleasure and a handout with helpful links for Tamar's website. It also has a catalog search with all of her material that's in our collections if you ever want to come back and consult them in the reading room. And then there's also a link to the UW YouTube channel. So if you would like to refer back to this talk later, the video will be posted there. All right, without further ado, Tamar, I'll let you share your screen.
Oh, okay. Here we go. So I'll share my screen. And where'd we go? There we go. And there we go. Okay. Hi. First, thank you to everyone who came to the talk, and especially thank you to all you people in the room who are live. That is really exciting that there's people there who could actually put their hands on the work. That's fantastic. And thank you for coming out in the heat, because I know it's hot. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about the work that's actually in your show right now is this Curvatures book, which is in the center of the screen here. And so I'm going to take you through my background and how I got to making this piece by showing you a little bit about me and my work and how I take all these pieces of antique textiles, antique paper, ephemera, and put it all together and make these books. And so even though using corsets or doll beds sometimes, I feel like my books, I still call them books because in a way they tell a story. And even though they don't have necessarily like paper pages, some of them do, but some of them have the pages become embroidered textiles. And there's a narrative woven through the textiles. And so I consider them artist books, like one-of-a-kind artist books. And so let's see, all of my work is sort of based around myself. Actually, it's all about me. That because I have this spine curvature, which is scoliosis, and as a kid, it sort of defined who I was because I had to wear a back brace to correct it from the time I was 13 to 16. And at the time, there was no social media. There was no getting together with groups to talk about your feelings. There was just a lot more suck it up, go to school, and you'll get out of this brace in a few years. Don't worry about it, move ahead. So keeping that inside for a long time. And as a creative person, I realized there's ways to put your feelings into places. And I thought, okay, let's figure out how I can start working out some of my issues besides going to therapy, which then got me to think, oh, I have time and I actually have access to a really good copier. So I always say, how do you make something when you have no idea what you're doing? And I'm going to talk about how I started making these paper books. And this was my first book called Insecurities Are My Limbs. And it was on vellum and acetate pages. And I discussed feelings of isolation and what happens if you feel parts of you are sort of attached, but maybe not. So is it a real limb? Is it an orthopedic limb? And part of this book also is that I like the idea of taking text and overlapping it with images. And that's how you'll see a lot of that overlapping with images coming up in all my work. And that's how this book came to be. And because so much of my work is I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how to put my work together. So what do I need to do? And so this very first book the trick about this book is that each page is 1/2 of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So basically, I laid out all these pages with glue stick and Xeroxes on white pieces of paper and figured out which pages would be acetate pages, which pages would be vellum pages, and made copies. And then I cut all the pages in half, and then I had a book that was 5 by 7. And that's how I got through this first project without knowing anything that I was doing. And so once I got through this book, I was like, oh, okay, now I want to make something bigger. So, and maybe I want to use color. And that's how it got to my next paper book, which was using color Xeroxes, using acetate and vellum pages. And also, this time I literally took some of my corsets or my back braces and put them on the copier machine and actually made copies, because I thought, okay, I want to own this a little more. Let me try to work through some of this stuff. And the title of the book, To Exert as Oneself, is actually embroidered text on top of corseting buckle straps. Those are, yeah, the material from corsets. And so this book talks about women's bodies, how they've been defined by other people, how they've been squished into mechanical shapes. And it got me thinking of women's bodies as the mechanics of how your spine supports your body. And then it got me thinking about my own back brace and how it supported me. And then I thought, what happens if I take this back brace and I make it into a paper doll? And so then I put it on top of the Venus de Milo, which it was considered at one point like, the ultimate perfect woman. And I thought, well, okay, I could put that on acetate and I could make it, so you turn the page and then the brace comes off and then the brace goes back on. And so I talked about here, the text on the page are about different responsibilities of growing up and trying to figure things out and having to make adjustments. And it's not just adjustments mentally, but it's literally adjustments physically, because with that back brace, I actually had to get my own set of screwdrivers to go to summer camp with, because the brace sometimes loosens itself. So there were times where I was literally taking out my screwdrivers to kind of keep it all together, because that was one of the things you had to do when you wore it. But on a side note, and I'll come back to this next book later on, but using these body images as sort of paper dolls, this book that I did has the same thing. I mean, this is like 10 years, 15 years later, and I kind of circled back to the idea of taking a brace and putting it on top of a body form. These pages are actually digitally printed pages on cotton bed sheets that became a book that was all based around an advertising tape measure for women's corsets and balls corsets. And so this was another page that that material is sort of sheer, so that it has some hand embroidery on it, and then you lift it up and then there's a body form underneath it. And we'll come back to this book in a little bit, but I just wanted to show you that. So back to this book. So now for the paper book, the question is, how did I get to this corset book that's all embroidered text inside a big corset? And basically, I had a paper book and I talked about having to wear a corset and how it made me feel. And then I thought, I want these stories to come off the paper. Like, I want them to be more part of the material. So the way I see it is that if I have the text embroidered into the actual antique textile, then it feels like the textile is speaking, because the words, the new embroidery thread is mixing with the old thread of the antique textile that I'm using. And so part of this also is what I call slow art, because when I started embroidering this corset, I got a little obsessed with the fact that every part of it had to be covered with text. And so the section behind those laces, you would have to undo all the laces to open up the whole corset to see the rest of the text, which will really take a long time. And my feeling is, well, that's the point, because that will give you time to think about what women had to go through all those years, lacing up, lacing in, being confined in this clothing, in theory, for their own good. And yeah, and I realize it takes a long time to look at this stuff, so it's not always so popular, but okay. And the next thing I wanted to show is that part of, again, the mechanics of making these pieces is always sort of one of the things I have in mind. And so when I built this very first corset book, and I wanted one corset to open up into another, into another, into another, the stories stitched were laid out in such a way that all the inside text, the stuff that would be closest to your body if you were to actually wear these corsets, were all from personal materials. They were from diaries, they were from letters, they were from, at that point, there were not blogs, but there were some sort of like chat rooms. There was just beginning of chat rooms for scoliosis people. And so I began emailing with people to ask them about their histories of wearing this brace. And so some of their words are also all embroidered in this. And then the outside of the corsets are all sort of like second person, like second generation text. It's like from etiquette manuals, instruction manuals, behavioral manuals, historical documents that told women how to carry themselves, how they should, behave and, well, carry themselves with these corsets. And also there's text from patents, because I happen to be interested in patents. And the words that I realize are hard to see on the very tiny corset in the front says self-reducing and limb shaping. And those words, I tend to take a lot of words from corset advertising because I could actually never come up with those ideas myself. I thought some advertising person had to figure out a way to describe these things. And that's how they described one of the corsets. So, and even though I did this, I wanted to show you this historical piece of the fact that women have been embroidering text on clothes for a very long time. And this piece was done by Agnes Richter, who was a German woman who was held in a psychiatric hospital. And this piece of clothing that you're looking at was sort of a standard hospital gown that was given to everybody at the facility. And she hand embroidered statements that says, I mind my jacket, my white stockings, I live on the ground floor. One of them, some of the notes said, I wish to read, and I plunge headlong into disaster. And so using her personal garment as a diary was obviously something that, I mean, me using it, I thought, oh, this is such a novel idea. But no, people have been using their personal garments as places to put their feelings about ideas about their bodies and their situations for a long time. And so, okay, that's Agnes Richter. And then I was going to talk about the paper dolls, because my projects have veered off into different, we have corset books, we have bed books. The bed books are also, there's some there in the room that you can put your hands on. Basically, I was reading a lot of Victoriana about women's history, and I noticed that women talked about housework and clothing a lot. So the beds became a whole other separate project, as women were sometimes confined to their beds, and stories around beds, I kept noticing them. So I collected them and put them aside, and that's one side of my work. But with the corset books, I started getting more interested also into different sizes of corsets, human size, doll size. Not sure why dolls needed corsets, but since girls were taught to dress like their mothers, they used the dolls to sort of learn how to dress up like their mom, which brings us to this piece of ephemera, which was by the Duplex Corset Company. If you bought a corset, you got a paper doll, and then you can give this paper doll to their kids to, give them something to do while they're playing with their dolls. And the one thing I wanted to mention about what's so crazy about this doll actually is that the sleeves on this Victorian dress are very, very narrow. So the armhole on this specific dress is very narrow so that women could never like get their hands over their heads and sort of wave their arms around because that would be considered really unladylike. And so they were sort of not just held in place by their corset, but also by their clothing that sort of had them bound sort of in a specific form where they couldn't get a lot of movement. So while thinking about dolls, I saw these girdle advertisements and I thought, wow, these women sort of look like billboards to me, kind of like the paper dolls. What happens if I try to make them into a more modern day paper doll? And so I made a project that had two parts to it. And the first volume, this is it, called What to Wear. Volume 1, The Cultured Waste, Her Valiant Fight Against Time. And again, this is all text. I wish I could say I wrote this, but this was from advertising, where somebody wrote that it's a valiant fight against time. And so this is a human size bra, a very large kind of bralette. And then inside, I put all the dolls that were waiting to be unfolded that people can play with. And the idea behind this piece is that I used, based on advertising about the corsets, was that women's feminine beauty was divided into 3 classes based on a Greek goddess description of there's women's bodies who are a Juno, a Venus, a Psyche. And that's how they were selling their corsets to women. And so you had these descriptions of them. And so I made these dolls that came out and they were all, basically you got to undress their girdles where they had text on their bodies. And then on the other, this is a close-up of what it all looks like. And then on the back, there's just more text continuing different advertising sayings that were made. And so part of this, after I got done working with these dolls, I was like, I want to continue working small. What can I do that could, maybe hold something small in my hand? And sometimes my work gets based on the textiles that I have. And sometimes it's also about the ephemera that I have. And this corset pamphlet is about 4 inches big. It's very tiny. And so I decided to pair it with a doll corset. And so this, what's called Society's Corset, I remade the entire catalog, but this time using women's lingerie materials. So things people don't usually get to fondle unless you're a woman in the lingerie department and you're looking to wear stuff. So this book is made out of silks and chiffons and other sheer and organzas. And so the funny thing about it is that the entire little pamphlet has these women posing with household objects. And so I'm not sure why. I guess they figured women are in the home. And so here's this woman posing with a chair. And they're talking about how the Binner corset is the choice of women who care. And what I did is I went back to using images with sheer materials and putting text on top of the images to try to make more like you come up with a third idea. What's that text mean? What's the image mean to you? And then putting the two together, how does it make you feel? And so what was interesting, I thought, was that on the left side are these ideas of beauty. It says from 1848, let your dress harmonize with your complexion, your size, and the circumstances in which you may be placed. But on the right side was a woman, Catherine Mansfield, who was, she was a New Zealand critic and writer who in 1915 wrote, I feel a little bit more cheerful today because I don't look so revolting. And there's something about putting those words in a really nice script on a really silky piece of material that I just really loved. I also feel like that feeling of I don't look so revolting feels incredibly modern to me. I mean, this is over 100 years ago, but I think there's still plenty of us that will get up and say or feel that way during the day. And I just thought, wow, some things just haven't changed at all. And the last thing I wanted to show you on this book, oh, wait, two things, was first that woman that had that text over her. It seems like the charm of womanly contours in this long curved corset from armpit to ankle. It's rare to hear about your armpit in corseting materials. And I think in general, people don't talk about their armpits very often. So I thought that was kind of unusual for this pamphlet to be mentioning that. And also for a long time, I thought this woman was staring at a loaf of bread. And I always, I called this file Woman Loaf of Bread because I always thought that's what it was. But it wasn't until I put together this presentation where I realized I think she's staring at a bowl or a flower pot, or maybe just a bowl. I'm not even sure. Still something from the house. And part of making this book was working with a woman, Carla Bellicio, who's a seamstress. And Carla had made me a sample book where we took a bunch of pages and printed them out, and then she sewed them so I could see all the different edges that you could possibly do with these materials. Like some of them are folded and ironed, some of them have glue on the edge, some of them are stitched in certain ways so that the fraying doesn't happen. And we were trying to figure out how to bind this book to put it inside a corset. And so she had came up with the idea with the grommets that then we could lace inside the corset, which is how that book came together. And let's see, this was, okay, the historical documents and textiles. When I was growing up, I had a book just like this. And it was a book that taught you how to tie your shoelaces, how to do a snap. I really love these things. And I thought, well, what happens? Can I try to make one for an adult? Like with all these things I'm learning about how to dress better as a woman. So this book, The Effect of the Whole, which is where some of the images I showed a little while ago came from, became a book that was all based on materials that I had. One of them was a ball's corset tape measure. And that became the way the book was sort of bound together. So you kind of have like an implied spine by using this tape measure to hold the book together. And then the book itself was buttoned inside the corset. And those are the same buttons that were used, that were placed inside. This is a child's corset that then were buttoned to hold up children's stockings. So the hose would then button to these buttons that were sort of put inside the waist. And so this book was a combination of using the ball's corset tape measure that had stories on it. The small text on this are supposedly letters written to the company saying how much they loved their corset and how delightful they felt in it. I just like the fact that they had an advertising tape measure that if you bought a corset, you got a tape measure and then you'd bring it home to measure the clothes you're going to make while wearing their corset and constantly be reminded, don't forget about our corsets because you have our tape measure. And this fabric book, as part of the embroidery, like on this one, is one of those things where you could pull out the string and then redo the embroidery up the page if you wanted to, as sort of like based on those, like the children's books. And just also on a side note, this company, Ferris Corset, they had a corset for every part of your life and whatever thing was going on in the world. This was for the Columbia Exposition in the 1890s. They would have a corset for it. So the fact that they had an advertisement, the first Ferris wheel, well, one had been invented for the Paris Exposition, but Mr. Ferris made a wheel that came to Chicago. And this was the first type of Ferris wheel in this country at that time. It was a very big deal to see this ride there. And the fact that they put their woman in a corset in the center of it. And then it also kind of goes back to the mechanics of women sort of strung up in their clothing, but here this woman seems to be sort of in the center of this, I don't know, like supportive material for the Ferris wheel. Kind of struck me as a funny thing. But let's see, other ads, moving to slowly getting towards that curvature book. The ads that I've collected over the years about how to cure spinal curvature is just one of the many things I collected. And one of the more craziest things was this picture from 1908 that showed patients crawling for exercise as a way to cure spinal curvature. It's interesting, there's no boys in this room. It's just all girls that seem to have this, although I've seen pictures of boys in books, but it definitely afflicted girls more. I don't think this was a successful way of curing it, but they tried. And then another way of trying to cure it was being sort of trussed up in various machines to try to force the spine to straighten itself. And part of this being trussed up and having your arms in the air, it's sort of a stretch of a connection, but it does sort of, for me, it made sense, made me think of these cheerleaders that had their arms in the air. And then that also made me think of when I was in high school and I couldn't be a cheerleader because I was wearing a brace. And I also wasn't very flexible enough or very athletic, actually. So I could never be a cheerleader, and all that went with it for the more popular kids in school at the time. But it made me think of this picture. And then, as also part of the collecting ephemera, this was another way to try to cure your spinal curvature, which was to wrap you in a plaster cast and leave you like that for a few years, to as if like while you're growing, this cast would force your spine to go straight. And that didn't quite work either. But this book from 1897 actually is now at the university, is now you guys have it in your collection as part of the stuff I sent along. And so this image is what became the cover of the curvatures book that's in the show right now. How I wanted to translate the engraved drawings of trying to deal with spinal curvature and then translate it through a modern use of digital technology, digital embroidery. So this book, I had a bunch of fabric that I only had so much of, this wide banding that was used in some corseting materials, and I wanted to make a book. And I thought, okay, if I spell out the words curvature, I have just enough pages to put one letter on every page. And so I would take an image, a historical image, translate that to fabric, and have the text on it that talked about what it was like, the net effect, to talk about what the doctors were saying the net effect would be from wearing this corset. And then there'd be a letter to spell out curvatures, and then text on the bottom that again came from corset ads. So this whole book was sort of like me spelling out C-U-R. It was like my cheer to my spinal curvature. And by the end of the book, I finally thought, okay, maybe I'm finally over this. And so now in theory, you're supposed to be cured after wearing this brace and straightened out. And so we have actually, that is my x-ray of when I was done with wearing this brace. But as you can see, I'm not quite straightened out yet. And I always say, maybe this is why I tend to see things a little off. Like I never say anything has to be perfect, because the idea of perfect is, it means different things to different people. And sometimes good enough is okay, or things just being a little off-centered is okay also. And so, because I feel a little off-centered. And so that is how the book ended up ending, which was sort of my curve, my image, talking about how this straight contour effect from the brace was supposed to straighten me, but it didn't really. And then a picture, another embroidered image of one of the back braces from a pamphlet. And so that is sort of the visual part of this talk of how I got to the curvatures book that's in the show that you guys have. And I am open to, of course, any kind of questions or anything you might have. I don't know if I went through that too fast, but and how we're doing on time.
We're doing great on time. Thank you so much for
Sure.
explaining your work and talking us through your creative process and the history of these pieces. Curvatures is still on display in the exhibit, so if you'd like to look at it, definitely go and check out our exhibit in the reading room. And yeah, I'll open up the questions to audience members both in person and virtually.
Yeah, sure. Let me stop sharing here. There you go. Okay. If anybody has any questions? No, no questions?
Well, I have one to get it started, which is, where did you find that jacket from, what was it, Agnes Rudiger's?
Agnes Richter. Yeah. So that is online someplace. I remember hearing about it, oh my God, so many years ago. And I just thought, hey, there was a woman in an asylum that stitched on her jacket. I wonder if I can find it on Google. And then I started Googling around for it. And I want to say it was photographed at the hospital. Like it's part of a museum collection now. And I don't know if is it part of like folk art by, people who were in insane asylums. There's collections like that of artwork, or if it came from a textile collection. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just wondered, I read about that jacket in Threads of Life.
Oh, yeah.
Have you come across that book? There's a whole chapter about the piece. I just think it's very interesting. And
oh, well, it's funny. Well, now that you mentioned that, I'm just going to mention this other thing. And I know you guys aren't showing the beds, but for people who are online here listening to this, I do this other artwork where I embroider the story of women in their beds, depending on different bed themes. And the idea is that you pull back the covers and you read their stories. So, but one of the things that I thought about when I did that was something called the Elizabeth, oh my God, I can't read my own handwriting because I forgot her last name. Oh, it's the Elizabeth, blah. It's a sampler that's over at the V&A. And a woman who in the 1830s was working as a housekeeper at a family, but her boss was like kicking her down the stairs and beating her up. It was really horrible. And so she would stitch every night into this bed sampler. And so she would tell the story of like, oh, she took it on herself, just saying, I'm a really bad person. And she blamed herself for everything that was happening to her. And then no one really knew what happened to her until somebody picked it up and made it their PhD thesis. And it was fascinating because eventually she got out of that place and then she became a teacher. And then she eventually, when she retired, they gave her, the Teaching Association in England somewhere gave her a home that she had to live, she got to live in until she died. But her life really got a lot better. But when you see this hand stitched on a bed, and she's just talking about like, they threw the candle down the stairs and I fell after it. And, God's punishing me because I'm such a broken soul. And you just think this is terrible. And just the thought also in the 1830s, trying to stitch this stuff at night when it's really dark. So many things, like how she had to do it when nobody was looking. And it's a very, very large piece that's at the V&A. That was one of my inspirations for, doing
so on the topic of the beds, actually, I have a question written down, and we also got it in the chat. It's a little outside of the scope of the health portion, but we'd love to hear about your process related to your bed pieces and just anything you'd like to share.
Oh, okay. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm just looking at the chat now. So, right. Can you talk about the beds a little more? Okay. I can talk about the beds a little more. I'm wondering if I could share my screen and show people my beds, but it's okay. So the beds are mostly all stories of women, although there's one bed that's about a relationship story. And I was going to see if I can call these up really quickly, but why don't I just go to my website? And then that way I could just share my screen. There we go. Oh, okay, here we go. Hold on. I'm just going to share the screen really fast so that you guys can see where'd they go? There we go. Can you guys see these beds that are here? Is that something, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So you see, like, this is a hospital bed, and that is about stories about women in the hospital who are giving birth in the hospital and what happened to them. This will be yours is about women who go into situations where maybe they were being sent away to school and what it was like to have to live in a dormitory full of girls. Some of them were women who were away from their homes and they were living, they got a job maybe at a textile mill, and they talk about living in a house with lots of other women and what happens. The Didn't Sleep Much bed is about women on the road heading out on the Overland Trail, heading out to Oregon. And what was so crazy is that when I was reading people's diaries, how often somebody's bed was mentioned. I'm like, don't they have other things to mention? But no, they're being attacked by Indians and they're using their bed as, you know, a wall to, you know, protect themselves from the bows and arrows. And then also it seemed like if you saw people's bed by the road, nobody touched it because it meant somebody died of a disease and they didn't know what to do about the disease. So they threw out the mattress and they threw out the bed. So as they went west, they were just like getting rid of certain things to lighten the load, and the beds were one of them. Some of the others, I don't know if you can see my pointer on this. This green bed that looks like a camping bed, those are all stories about the history of nursing and Florence Nightingale, because she was a woman way ahead of her time during the Crimean War, but also that she invented like one of the first pie charts. And so she used a pie chart to kind of talk about health and nursing and diseases and what they can do, because so many people were dying in the hospitals, not from their wounds, but from the diseases they were getting at the hospitals, because nobody knew anything about germs and how to keep things clean. So all these beds that you see are all doll beds with different themes, except for this one here with the chain. It's a life-size bed. It's a bed about, it's a tuberculosis cure bed that was gifted to me by someone who got it out of the dump. Unbelievable. Up in Lake Placid, because up in Lake Placid, there was the tuberculosis sanitariums where people would be in their beds. There wasn't penicillin yet. So they would lie out in the weather on these porches up in the Adirondacks, breathing fresh air, because that was the only way they knew how to try to get rid of tuberculosis. And so this bed was based around a 16-year-old's diary that is at the library up at Saranac Lake, where this girl writes about being in this sanitarium and how boring it was until the cute guy came in next door, and then they got to go to the movies together. So there was like a whole life for people stuck at these sanitariums trying to keep people occupied because there wasn't much for them to do. And this girl only got to be in the sanitarium because her mom worked there. So she got to live there at a discount. And other beds, I was going to say Brought to Bed was sort of one of those beds. It was about child rearing and giving birth at home and the history of childbirth and how it used to be literally in the hands of midwives, and how as the medical field was changing, the male doctors realized they were losing money on having women giving birth. And so they should try to get that activity to happen at hospitals. So then they were trying to convince women like, oh, well, if you have the money, you should come to our hospital because we'll really take care of you. But what they didn't realize is nobody was washing their hands in the hospital because nobody understood about germs. So for the first so many years, women would go to the hospital to give birth and then everybody died because people would just go from birth to birth without cleaning themselves. It was really not very good. And so eventually, that's what that bed was about. Taking to Bed is about a woman, the women, like besides the author who wrote God, sorry, I'm having a mind break. The flowered wallpaper book. And she talks about postpartum depression and going crazy in her room because her husband like basically said, "Oh, you just had a baby, you need to stay in bed." And she's like, "No, I need to go out and do stuff." And he's like, "No, just stay in bed." And so it's about all these women who took to bed for various reasons. And she's somebody's just okay, I'm seeing, sorry, someone's telling me to clarify that the sheets on all these beds, when you take off the covers of the beds, there's words on the top cover, but then there's words on every level of the bed, on the top sheet, the bottom sheet, the fitted sheet, the the quilts, everything has text on it. And right. And thank you, Nava, for telling me, yes, it's The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who's actually, her words are throughout many of the beds, actually. And so that is sort of the short version of all these beds that have different themes. Oh, just on a side note about libraries, because I love libraries. This book, Things Girls Like to Do, I was at a library and I was looking in the stacks, and I came across a book about teaching girls how to do housework, but it's being taught by supposedly the little people, like very little people that live in your house and live in the cupboards. So the story goes, these people come out and teach this kid how to do housework in the house. And one of them is that there's a sheet music about making your bed. And I thought, this is the craziest thing ever, but I have to make a bed about doing housework because this is crazy. And I always say that nothing beats going to a library and doing turning your head sideways and looking at all the books on the shelves and seeing what catches you, and then taking the book off the shelf and thumbing through it, because that's the way I found so much material. And I know some libraries now are saying they don't collect necessarily paper books because if the book has been digitized, they don't feel the need to keep the book on the shelves and everyone's short on space, which I understand. But I still say I'm a paper person in that sense. So I still like looking at libraries.
So we do have a question in the chat.
Yes.
But we also have a hand raised in person.
Okay.
Mine does kind of relate to the
sure.
bed. Our lovely colleague, Kate Leonard, has been making boxes for your beds. And so I was able to see how much documentation you provide along with your artist books. And
yeah,
so many of your books are about you personally and your personal interests, and not most artists don't provide that much information or documentation about their work. So what about you personally sort of drives you to do that extensive documentation and share it with the collecting institutions?
Yeah, I think because I'm a little obsessive. It took me a long time. I have a day job where I organize business meetings, which is really really soul sucking, but it gave me the money to produce this artwork. And in that, everybody I work with is incredibly detailed oriented. And also I'm a list maker. And so I tend to make lists and go down and check off. And when I first started doing the artwork, I would just send off the artwork. And then I thought, oh, maybe people would want to see where this information came from because it will prove I'm not making stuff up. So when I read stuff, I keep, the way I did the text is I have 4 or 5 volumes of like binders. That's literally, I mean, I have it on the computer too, but it's all paper printouts of all the text I've collected from corset ads and reading. And then I have another binder that's just bed stories. And then those bed stories got put into categories or chapters about, this is about hospitals, this is about World War I, whatever. And so now as time went on with every project, I was like, oh, maybe I should send them, the text to the project. And then also then it got to, I'll send them the text and I'll send them the bibliography of where the text came from so that they know this is like a real thing and I didn't make anything up. And I guess also, I don't have the patience, honestly. I'm a blabbermouth and I don't have the patience with being secretive. So I feel like, you know what, here's the information, do what you want with it. It's all, like, it's all okay. It's not, yeah. So I'm okay sharing stuff, which is why, like, if you have any questions, I have, as my husband will say, no filters. So you can ask me anything because really I don't have any filters. And then I don't know if that answered your question though.
Yeah,
yeah.
no, that's great. That's lovely.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I try to provide the stuff that, that I think people might find interesting because I won't be around to explain it. So I feel like also if there's stuff there to explain it, maybe that will make it seem or keep it relevant for people to see where stuff came from. And yeah, but I guess should I be looking at this, Kat, should I look at this question in the chat from
Well, before
Virgil?
you go too far,
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned actually browsing material books, and one of the main parts of the exhibit and the reason that we selected your work for it is because of the materiality of the piece and how that operates as a medium. So I was wondering if you'd be willing to touch on how you see medium and message carried out through your work.
I guess, I mean, it's funny because when I think I told you this, when I first heard about the medium as the message, it sort of threw me back to high school when I did a paper on Marshall McLuhan. And he wrote this whole thing on the medium as the message, which was about advertising in the 60s and 70s and how people devour information and messages. And it made me think, and then part of me thought, oh my God, I don't remember what I said in the paper. I just know that I got really into it, and it made me think that I wanted to be like, go work in advertising. So when I applied to colleges, I was like, I'm going to be an art student and a business major, thinking I would go into advertising and do this. And then basically I was failing out of economics and accounting. And with no matter how much help I was trying to get, I was like, I am not grasping this concept of macroeconomics. I think I better just stop the business part, much to my father, I think, was a little sad about that. But then I just stuck with the art part of things. But I think with the message, I mean, I guess with the artist books, I feel like it's like sort of a cliche, but I say the idea of like the spine of the book is sort of built into what I do because I'm always talking about body stuff. And there is a point where I remember thinking on some of my projects, I'd be working on a corset book, and at some point I'd be like, oh my God, I think I'm boring myself. Like I'm talking about myself so much, I really just have to shut up because I don't know if what I have to add is even important anymore. But then maybe I'd find a piece of ephemera like those ball tape measure. And I was like, ooh, this is interesting. I like pictures and I like text, and this tape measure has both. Maybe I can make a book using this. So then I'd sort of go off in a different direction of like, it's not really about me. It's indirectly about me, but not really at that point. I can find other things to talk about other women's bodies and sewing or creating things for clothing or something that wasn't quite directed. And I think using the used textiles, like especially with the beds too, I always try to use used textiles because I feel like those textiles come with a history. And even if that history has nothing to do with the way I'm using them, I still find old textiles, old sheets, old bedding, all of that stuff is more interesting to me than starting with something new. But also I just like old stuff. And you can see behind me, my bedroom, I have a lot of old hangers. It started off with one travel hanger from a grandparent and then sort of became a hanger collection. I collect different things. And so it's, I just tend to like old stuff. So I tend to gravitate towards using older materials that then I feel like I could sort of tell a new story on top of their old history. Does that make sense?
I thought was interesting about when you were speaking about your presentation was the blending of the obviously modern additional text to the historic garments.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of marrying the two. So before we get too far ahead, I just want to spotlight Virgil's question and comment here, which says, so many questions, but just a comment and then a question. I find so interesting the evolution of technology within the time span of your practice from photocopying and hands-on research to the internet age and digital marketing. the relationship of analog to digital, and the aspect of archival preservation. Also, the seemingly impracticality of physically handling your works. Are you interested in exploring virtual forms of presenting and preserving your work? Virtual reality, for example. Do you think about that? Could you speak to that a bit?
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to say, and I know Virgil won't appreciate this, this is artist Virgil Marti, Marti. So everyone can go Google him after this show. And he's one of my oldest friends because we went to the Washington University in St. Louis together. And so Virgil's an artist in his own right. And it's interesting that he's saying this because I'm going to share my screen again, just so you could see how I crawled into the digital age. I was going to say crawled into the digital age. You can see this video? And you can see this video moving?
Yes.
Yeah. Conventional Burdens was a crinoline book that was put inside a bird cage. And so so it is very hard to handle my books. And that's an issue with artist books because you want people to see them. But the reality is you really don't want everyone's hands all over them all the time because they'll disintegrate. And so what do? And so sometimes when they're displayed, they're in vitrines. And there have been at one or two shows, somebody made a video of my hands opening up the corset book so that people could see all the pages. And then it got to the point where, my website is too flat. It's not interactive enough. Maybe I need to start making videos of what these books look like because the still pictures aren't enough. So from a digital standpoint, I made videos that kind of showed, what the pages of the books look like. And for a long time, I struggled with, does the video become its own piece of artwork? And do I try to make the videos really fancy so that they become something that is more than the book? Or am I just using the videos as here is the artifact, take a look, because you can't see the pages yourself, but in the video, I can show you every page. And that way you can get a feeling like you're scrolling through it or looking through it. So I started doing that. And I also, with the beds, I have my hands that are unmaking the beds on videos. So people can see how the beds get taken apart and put back together. So they can see all the way down to the mattress, because sometimes there's embroidery on the mattress. I mean, there is always embroidery on the mattress. But trying to digitize the actual work, somebody had asked me about my paper books, if I would make them all digital. I think I just only had so much because my day job is, if I'm working 12 or 15-hour days. And it used to be months at a time, but over the years, the jobs have gotten shorter. So then I had more time to do artwork and less time for day jobs. But I was just tired. And so I just never bothered, like the paper books are just what they are. And I never made them digitally. Like I never bothered to digitize them. And I think there was a point where I thought, if I had like the pink corset book and paper, but I could make it a digital thing where you could almost walk into it, like something really ridiculously big, like a billboard that then you could turn the pages digitally and be standing inside the book pages, would be a really cool thing. But I haven't actually gone out to look for funding or anything to turn any of my work into anything digital. So I guess that's kind of like a big no, that I haven't done anything that has tried to preserve my work digitally, besides like these little videos that kind of show my work as it is. And yeah, I haven't done my attention span for digital stuff. As much as I remember studying in art school in the 80s, we were studying digital video artists from the 60s and 70s, and it was all really interesting. And then I went to film school, but still making digital work or film work, it just never, for whatever reason, it just never became my thing. I think I missed putting my hands on paper and fabric and moving things around. And even with the paper books, for a long time, or the corset books, I laid things out with a glue stick on paper so I could visualize it before I moved it to fabric. And then eventually I started laying stuff out Photoshop on pages and then printing them out so I could see what they'll look like, and then I'd print them out on fabric. But I just never made the actual books into a digital kind of thing.
So
Yeah.
Virgil wonders, or is it that the physical tactile aspect is more important?
The physical tactile, but you know, I was this crinoline book right now lives at the Bainbridge Art Museum in their art book collection. So it's true, a lot of people aren't going to be able to like put their hands on this book because it's like in that one place. So it's sort of like, I guess in a perfect world, I would have done, you know, like a very fancy video where you're swooping inside the cage and you're, you know, part of it or something. But I didn't know any people at the time I thought who could help me. And I think then the pandemic came and I was like, oh, I just need to get this out of my house so I could try to focus on something else, because while it was sitting in front of me, it made me feel like, I don't know. Yeah, it just made me feel like I was sort of stuck until I could sort of move on from it. So I don't know, Virgil, if that answered all your questions, but you can ask me more next time I see you, unless there's more I should answer for the group.
Does anyone have follow-up questions related to digital?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. You know, the birthing girdles. Somebody wrote, in thinking about birth and historical textiles containing text, just curious if you've heard of the medieval birthing girdles given to women during birth, inscribed with prayers and saints to comfort women. And no, I haven't. And that sounds fascinating. I've seen birthing chairs. Yeah, I've seen medieval birthing chairs, but I've never heard of this before. Wow. Thank you for that, Aubrey, because yeah.
Yeah, no, mine was in a similar vein to the idea of like digital preservation. But when you were speaking, it sounded like the act of sort of like untying or uncovering things is a very important part of your work. And I wasn't sure if there was a way that you try to maintain that as a part of your work once they enter collections. Because usually once they enter collections, you know, we're trying to get less hands on them as opposed to more for conservation reasons. So I wasn't sure if there was something that you do as an artist to try to, you know, maintain that.
No, that's a fabulous question, because yes, a reason that more of those pieces in the early years should have been made videos of to show people how it all works. And it's interesting you should say that, because I'll just tell you, when I had sent off that birdcage piece, I had pictures of like all the pictures on the website. This is what it looks like. And then that video, this is how you take it apart. This is how you put it together. And then I packaged it and I took pictures of how to package it and I sent it off. And then I saw pictures of it on display and I was a little heartbroken because they put it together inside out. And I was like, oh no. I said, I thought I was so obvious. And it taught me I wasn't obvious enough, because I thought like, oh, it goes corset with crinoline on top of it or something. But the way it was in the birdcage on display, the corset was sitting on top of the crinoline. But the way the women dressed, the crinoline was tied around the waist of the corset. So the bottom of the corset sat underneath your crinoline. And so I felt bad, but I sent an email explaining that. Sort of saying, yeah, if you want, it's yours now, but if you want, you can, you know, set it up in a way that, yeah, as I intended. I don't think anyone noticed but me, except that the person that did some embroidery on the top of the crinoline that then got covered up by putting the corset on top of it. And I felt bad, like, oh, we purposely put that detail in and now it's getting covered up. And so
that's a great segue, because we have two people in the chat wondering if the embroidery on your pieces is hand done or by embroidery machine.
Okay, I'm going to tell you because it's both. And I'm also going to tell you, and whether it's another dirty secret that people don't talk about in the art world of who does your work. because I am a horrible seamstress and I can sew holes in my socks, but I'll admit by the time they rip, by the third time, that's it. The sock is gone. Like I'll sew the hole twice, but that's it. Then I'm done. So what I learned is my feeling was that if I wanted, when I started making artwork, that if I wanted to ask for money for my artwork, I had to believe that technically it had to be the best possible, technical, tightest work out there. And so that got me to find someone who was a digital embroiderer, because my feeling was if I know I couldn't do it, I wasn't going to spend the thousands of dollars on a machine and then spend 5 years trying to learn how to master the machine. I would rather I had to go to the day job, do my work, pay my rent, but let me spend some of that money and pay the person who's a professional to do this work. So the person who I started working with had never done anything like this before. They were doing like sweatshirts and making curtains for people. They were like a one-person operation working out of their home that my mother-in-law introduced me to this person in Long Island. And so we started working together, and it was really trial by fire of like, oh, can you make the words this big? Can they be smaller? Can I use script? Can I use block text? It was really trying to learn like how the digital embroidery worked and what, you know, how letters can be seen or not seen depending on the direction of the stitch. And the color of the threads could, like, one color green could look 3 different shades depending on which way the digital embroidery went. So it was a lot of trial and error. But then in the last few years, I kind of got more, the last few pieces, there's digital embroidery, but there's a lot more hand embroidery. And that's also because I know that I had turned to Carla, who started also putting my books together. And she very much is a puzzle solving person. And so she would be like, hey, we could bind it like this, or there's a thing called this, and you could try to use it to make this attached to this. And I was like, oh, there's all these sewing things I know nothing about, but someone who does this for a living. She was like the seamstress at the New York City Men's Department Ballet, and she does stuff on Broadway. So she knows all this stuff that I just didn't have access to. So I did go out and buy a hand embroidery book, because I thought, well, I used to embroider when I was 13 years old, because in the 70s, a lot of us did that on our jean jackets. But I know I have a very low tolerance. I get frustrated very easily. So I didn't stick with it for many years. So Carla would, like, you know, do stitch samples for me and say, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? We could do this, we could do that. And she was like really very much like into being a partner. And my feeling is I'm really happy to work a job and then pass along the money to someone who does a really fabulous job on making a piece that I see in my head, but actually making it to where I can hold it in my hands. And so that's, you know, I come up with the ideas and I work out the concepts, and then I have people technically pull it together, because they are definitely more talented than I am on those kinds of things. Yeah, so it's a combination of digital and hand.
Great.
Yeah.
Are there any questions in person? Go ahead.
How did the pandemic inspire your work?
Yes, you said, how did the pandemic inspire my work? Yeah, I'm only laughing because I know I am one of the few, you know, all over social media, people are like, oh, I'm discovering bread making. I'm getting back to my roots of painting, and look, I'm woodworking. And not me. I was an artist, I think, who was working every free moment when I wasn't working for money. I was doing artwork. I was sitting at the computer. I was either reading stuff, or I was always working. And somehow when the pandemic hit is when I hit a wall, where instead of being super creative, I mean, in my workroom, I had a whole project I was going to start, which was about women girdles, salesman sample stuff, more of that. And I set it all up so it looked like I was going to start this project. I had paper dummies of everything, but I hadn't figured out the words, and I hadn't figured out how pieces were going to go together. And it sat like that for 18 months, where I'd walk into the room, get a knot in my stomach, and then I'd just walk out. And then I really embraced Netflix. I mean, I really, no shame here. I just sat on the couch and really watched a lot of Netflix. And then by weird timing or not, It became in the spring of 2021, I had to become very involved with my parents' elder care. And then slowly, as we came out of the pandemic, my parents needed more care. They had to move. I had to sell their house. That whole part of my, like, I just got involved with that. And so then the art that was on hold kind of stayed on hold. I picked up, I do traditional rug hooking, which is you take strips of wool and you use a hook and you, here, well, I'll put that on the screen here. There we go. Can you guys see these rugs? These rugs, do you see that? I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. So these rugs, like this, our first 3 years, this is a map, not realizing that my husband drew it backwards after the fact when it was done. It took 3 years to hook. And we said, oh, wait, how come, Washington State's on the upper right-hand corner and Georgia's on the lower left. It was our first 3 years of dating before we became engaged. So these were the road trips we took and the things we saw and the horse that fell on my husband in Tennessee. This is a big one. After I did this, it's like, yeah, I'm not doing this again because it was like 3 years worth of, this was something I could do in front of, when you used to like Thursday night sit and watch Friends on TV, I could just sit there and hook and feel less like a couch potato because my hands were busy and I could just be working on something. And so I made these rugs over years and years. And then during the pandemic, I ended up making this rug here with the cats and the 2 dogs for my sister-in-law about who runs the house with her animals. And then after I finished that little mat, which was like 3 feet by 2 feet, I was like, oh, well, hey, if I made one for my sister-in-law, I should make one for us. So then I made this rug, which was sitting at the kitchen at my house in Northeast Pennsylvania, staring out the window and looking at all the birds on the feeders for, 18 months. I just sat there watching them devour all the bird seed. So then I made that rug for me. What I didn't realize is while I did this, because I did it in such a short time, I actually gave myself carpal tunnel. And then on top of it, I got trigger finger. So it was a problem where all of that ended up having to stop because then I had to have hand surgery, and then the hand surgery took a little longer to heal and all that. So I kind of stopped doing the rug stuff for a while, but I found the rug stuff very, you can turn off your brain and just sort of use your hands. So I find that kind of relaxing. I'm not good at actually embroidery. I don't have the patience, but the rugs I can do for whatever reason. It just seems to be my wheelhouse for that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Are there any questions? Okay, great. I want to give everyone enough time to look at your work in the classroom.
Sure.
And then also thank you again so much for doing this presentation with us.
Of course.
It's great to hear about your process. So we'll do a little round of applause here.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is all good. And yeah, no, thank you so much. And well, everybody looks at the work. Do we just sign off or we stay on? Or no, we're done.
If you want to head out, you are so welcome to. And if you want to watch creepily everyone while they look at your stuff, go for it. Or not creepily, either way.
I'm just sitting here. I mean, I could just sit here, and if you guys want to ask me questions while you're looking at stuff, you can. I don't care.
Okay, great. Well, if you don't mind doing that. And,
yeah, sure. I'm just sitting here. That's fine. Go and take a look.
Have a great evening.
Thanks so much.
Now and
yeah,
see the rest of you maybe one day in person.